The need to feel secure is among the most basic of human desires. Most people are willing to give up almost anything for the feeling of safety. This is evidenced by the current trend where people, in the face of a breach of security, will call for their government to become more powerful to protect them, often at the expense of their most basic rights. After all, when reading about the evil actions of a dictator in a faraway land, who would not be in favor of giving the government all the power that it needs so that it can protect its people? When hearing about an innocent person who was mugged while walking to their car, who would not want an increased police presence on their streets? It would seem that a powerful government is a good thing, because it is able to protect against so many dangers. Is it true that for a country to maintain security, they need a big government, or is this detrimental to the safety of the people? Through Herodotus' histories, the governments of the past would be examined to determine how they were successful. However, given the storied past of once great regimes that have turned into tyranny, we must ask if a government is necessary at all. Thomas Hobbes expresses his opinion on this in his Leviathan. To determine the proper restraints of the government, and when it is acceptable to abolish the government, the founding documents of the United States of America and the writings of John Locke will be examined. To determine the best way for the people to be safe from the threat of overreaching government, Plato's concept of a citizen soldier, the protector of his perfect government, will also be examined. Through these texts, the ideal form of military for guarding a people from all dangers will be known. In order to answer the question of which form of military is the best to protect its people, it must first be known what exactly the threats that a people may face, and which of these are the duty of the government to protect against. In the Declaration of Independence, it says that they derive all rights, inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is the purpose of the government to protect these rights from anything that would seek to take them away. There are two threats to these rights, and they are the foreign and domestic threat. There are some criteria that need to be met in order to qualify as a threat. To qualify as a foreign threat, a foreign entity must have the capability to do significant damage, and they must have also shown the intent to attack another country to the point where there is reasonable suspicion that they will attack. Usually the goal of the foreign entity is to destroy or take over the other country. England is a powerful country that could certainly damage the United States greatly if they chose to, but they're not considered a foreign threat because they are an ally who has shown no evidence that they would attack the United States. North Korea is a foreign country that is nuclear capable and whose dictator is extremely unstable. This means they are considered a foreign threat. The presence of a foreign threat compels the need for a military capable of defending against those threats. The domestic threat differs from the foreign threat in that it originates from within the country itself. There are two kinds of domestic threats. The first is a threat from those who do not follow the rule of law. While it is the duty of the government to provide a safe environment for the populace, protecting against this kind of domestic threat, it is not a pervasive problem or one that would threaten the security of the nation as a whole. The second kind of domestic threat does not fall under the protection of the government. This is because the second type of domestic threat comes from the government itself. In this circumstance, the government of a country could attack its citizens and try and take away their life or their liberty. The goal the government seeks to achieve is to subjugate its people and become more powerful and more controlling of their lives. To simplify this all, it is the duty of the government to protect the people from all external threats that are both foreign and domestic, and the people are responsible to protect themselves from the threat of the government. The presence of this threat suggests that a government may be detrimental to the defense of tyranny. Now that the threats are known, what is the best way to defend against a foreign threat? The most important factor in determining victory is the level of preparedness. Amat victoria cumbram is a Latin phrase that says, victory favors the prepared. The most important thing to do in order to win is to be more prepared than the enemy. The Spartans were some of the most militarily prepared people that ever existed. Spartan boys were trained to fight from a young age and had to pass through an intense training process known as the agoge, where they learned everything from hunting to dancing. They also had an extreme loyalty to Sparta cultivated. A small force of 300 Spartans of the royal guard were able to hold the pass of Thermopylae, along with 700 Thespians on one flank and 400 Thebans on the other, for 3 days against the Persian army, which according to Herodotus numbered approximately 2,500,000 soldiers. In Herodotus' account of the battle, it was on the third day that when it was evident that they would all die, and Leonidas dismissed the majority of the Greeks that were with them. Quote, the allies then who were dismissed departed and went away, obeying the word of Leonidas, and only the Thespians and the Thebans remained behind, with the Lacedaemonians. Of these, the Thebans stayed against their will, but the Thespians very willingly, for they said that they would not depart and leave Leonidas and those with him. But they stayed behind and died with them. As the Persians clashed with the small resistance, the Spartans began to progress down their many tiers of weaponry. Now by this time, the spears of the greater number of them were broken. So it chanced in this combat, and they were slaying the Persians with their swords. And in this fighting fell Leonidas, having proved himself a very good man. A great skirmish then occurred over the body of Leonidas. but the Greeks were able to drag his body to safety and continued to fight so viciously, the Persians were forced to retreat 4 times. Eventually, the Greeks were forced to retreat to the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where they made their final stand. This conflict continued. From that moment, the nature of the combat was changed, for they retired backwards to the narrow part of the way and placed themselves all in a body together. On this spot, while defending themselves with daggers, that is, those who still had them left, and also with hands and with teeth, they were overwhelmed by the missiles of the barbarians. In the end, the greater number of the Persians overtook the remaining forces, and they were killed. Although the Spartans were not victorious, because they were prepared, they were able to fight far longer and more effectively than they should have been able to. While there were many more Persians than Spartans at Thermopylae, the battle was not easily won by the Persians as one might have expected it to be. The Spartans were superior to the average Persian foot soldier. Even the elite Persian troops, known as the Immortals, were no match for this small resistance. In part, this was due to the superior equipment that the Spartans carried. The Spartans carried large bronze shields that could withstand many blows and offered much protection for the Spartan himself and the men next to him. Contrast this to the wicker shields carried by the Persians. These could be cut to pieces in a few swings or easily pierced by a spear. The Spartans also wore bronze breastplates and helmets, whereas most of the Persians wore only robes. The Spartans wanted to never be outmatched, and so they carried large spears and short swords and daggers. As the fight went on and their weapons were lost or broken, they could quickly draw upon a new one. The Spartans also had superior training and practiced using the topography of their battlefield to their advantage. Perhaps most importantly, the Spartans were raised to be vicious warriors from an extremely young age, and taught that turning and running was the most disgraceful thing that one could do. In order to win a battle, it must first be won in the minds of the men fighting it. Men like this are cultivated by a military culture. The Spartan Danaeus was able to rally the men, for when the Persians fired their arrows, it is said that they obscured the sun, and the men's spirits wavered. To this, Danaeus gallantly called, "The battle against them shall be fought in the shade and not in the sun." The unbending will to fight was a most powerful asset for the Spartans. Most other men confronted with such great odds would have simply thrown down their arms and surrendered. The superior training, equipment, and resolve to fight of the Spartans was indispensable in holding the pass of Thermopylae. When it comes to fighting a foreign threat, a strong and capable military is necessary. A strong standing army is very effective at fighting foreign powers, but it is not perfect. A big government with a strong military poses a significant threat to the freedoms of the people that it protects. If the government ever becomes tyrannical and tries to take over, the people will likely not be able to effectively resist. One reason why Sparta's government did not become tyrannical is because every man was in their military. The government simply could not rely on the majority of their fighting force to oppress their people. The longer that people live in freedom, the less wary they will be of those who seek to put them in chains. Consider a country that starts out with very little government. The chances of tyrannical takeover by the government are low, and the people decide that they have a better chance of being attacked by another country, and so they decide to form a military that is always on watch. Now the country begins to face a new problem, that of criminal violence. The people decide that no one shall possess anything that can be used as a weapon, except of course for the government. This trend will continue until the people decide that the government shall be allowed to control speech, so that no one will harm another with offensive words. By using the government to fix all their problems, the people have backed themselves into a corner. Now if the government were to become tyrannical, the people could not protest peacefully or resist violently, because they gave away their right to speak their mind and the government has all the guns. A large military is detrimental to the security of the people in that they cannot effectively resist its rule. It seems that a government of any sort will eventually be disadvantageous to freedom. There are many instances in history where a government tries to seize control of its people. During the 1700s in England, a relatively small number of people controlled everything, and because they were unrestrained, they abused their powers and tried to seize the freedoms of the colonists. England began to tax the colonists unfairly, and then sent British troops to occupy the land and enforce the king's laws. As tension was growing in the colonies, the British banned the import and transportation of firearms by the colonists in 1774. In 1775, they attempted to confiscate rifles, muskets, and cannons. In 1776, the revolution had begun. The colonists were able to form an extremely effective fighting force with only 3% of their population. They went on to fight off one of the best navy in the world as well as one of the world's most powerful armies, and secured their freedoms in a new country with a new government. When the Founding Fathers were building their new government, they wanted to make sure that their ancestors would never again feel the sting of tyranny. Were the Founding Fathers naive for believing that a government could exist above its people without trying to subjugate them? The founders simply realized that a government had many goods that accompanied it, and they set out to design a government that would not become tyrannical. A government was important to the Founding Fathers because it has many benefits. but it was of equal importance to them that the government would never become tyrannical. James Madison wrote in the Federalist 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Men are certainly not angels, but if they were demons, no government would suffice." A country without a government can be just as terrible as a country with an oppressive government. Thomas Hobbes writes about a world without government in his Leviathan. Quote, "In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no arts, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." A government is necessary to have a long, joyful, and productive life, but it must be properly restrained if it is to be advantageous to the people. The founders devised a number of well-thought-out restraints on the government. These include ideas such as the separation of powers, as well as a restriction on a standing army. In the Constitution, they wrote Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, which says, "The Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years." This clause will help to prevent the government from having a very powerful military to wield against the people. With these restraints and a watchful people, the government should not become oppressive. In the Declaration of Independence, it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends that are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government. To ensure the ability to change the government, the founders designed several ways for the people to alter their government. The first thing the founders did was write out 10 specific rights of the people that are an area that the government is not allowed to touch. This provides a safe area for the people to operate in while they fix their government. The First Amendment to these rights says, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances." The people can use their freedom of speech and freedom to protest peacefully to rally support and tell their elected officials what to change. If the elected officials fail to recognize the authority of the citizens, the people can use their voting power to remove those members of government and replace them. If this does not work, the last peaceful method to stop an overreaching government is known as the Convention of States. In Article 5 of the Constitution, it says, "On the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid." By using the Convention of States, the people can correct their government in a peaceful manner by making new amendments which restrict their government. In this way, they can have a government and also have a way to control it. If the peaceful attempts to reform government fail, or the government begins to encroach on the Bill of Rights, the people can use their right to abolish the government. The right to revolution was a relatively new idea during the time of the Founding Fathers. In the Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas writes, a tyrannical government is not just, because it is directed not to the common good, but to the private good of the ruler. Consequently, there is no sedition in disturbing a government of this kind, unless indeed the tyrant's rule be disturbed so inordinately that his subjects suffer greater harm from the consequent disturbance than from the tyrant's government. Aquinas believes that the people have a right to stop a government that is not good for them, so long as they do not harm themselves more than the tyrant's rule would harm them. John Locke also believed in the right to revolution, writing in his second treatise of civil government, quote, "Whenever the legislatures endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience. By this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people who have a right to resume their original liberty." In Locke's view, the people and the government are two parties that have entered into a deal. The collective people have agreed to give up certain freedoms in exchange for the benefits that come along with government. When the government acts oppressively, they have violated their part of the deal, and the people are absolved of any responsibilities that they had to the government. In the Bill of Rights, the founders also included the Second Amendment, which says, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The purpose of this amendment is to ensure that the people will be able to protect themselves from tyranny of any kind. Thomas Jefferson is believed to have said that the beauty of the Second Amendment is that it will not need to be used unless the government tries to take it. If the people ever have to rebel forcefully against the government, they will be well armed and well equipped to do so. With the immense danger of big government military, it seems that a small military is worth its weight in gold because of its inability to subjugate its people. In this aspect, a small military is exceptional, and would have been the best form of military to use just mere decades ago. Unfortunately, with technological advances, this is no longer a viable option. A capable military may be especially important in an age where weapons of mass destruction exist. The ability to stop these weapons from being used is absolutely necessary, and it is a capability that is only available if there is a standing army awaiting orders. A small military is no longer a legitimate option for the security of a state. If the ideal form of government is not big and it is not small, the answer must be in between the two. The ideal form of military would consist of a small group of highly trained individuals who are the standing military, along with state militias, which can be organized into a larger fighting force if they are needed. In this model, the country has the ability to act swiftly, so if there is a time-sensitive situation, they may act quickly. Although this group of soldiers is always active, they do not number enough to threaten the country itself. Because these men could not take over their country, they also could not defend it from a large-scale invasion. How then would the country protect itself from enemy troops landing on its shores? This responsibility falls to the statesmen and their state militia. The idea of a citizen soldier first gained notoriety when philosopher Plato wrote about it in the Republic. Plato writes, "But war is an art so easily acquired that a man may be a warrior who is also a husbandman or a shoemaker or other artisan." Plato goes on to talk about how no tools will make a fine workman and no weapons will make a fine warrior. Plato believes that at least part of the population should receive military training while remaining citizens. This would instill many goods in them, but also give them the ability to defend their country. The concept of a citizen soldier was demonstrated during World War II, just after the unprovoked surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The Emperor of Japan ordered his top admiral to attack the mainland of the United States. At this point in the war, the United States military was very small, and the near entirety of its navy was underwater. The military alone would not have been able to protect the United States from invasion. Despite this, the admiral refused to invade, saying, "You cannot invade the mainland United States. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." He did not fear the United States military, but the people who would take up arms and defend their country. In the unlikely event that another military launched a full-scale invasion into the country, they would be walking into a land where a rifle hides behind every blade of grass. A group of citizens who take up arms would be just as effective, if not more effective, than a big military would be at defending from invasion. Because they are citizens first and militiamen second, the government would not be able to use the militias to take over the people, much like the Spartans would not be able to be used to take over their own people. In the event that a war is declared, the militia can be organized into a national military and kept in that status for the duration of the conflict. In order for a society to maintain their security, they cannot go to the extremes of the spectrum. A country with overbearing, unrestricted government will not be able to protect its people from its own government. On the flip side, a country without a government will not be able to protect its people from outside threats. If a country is to maintain its security from threats, on the outside as well as on the inside, the people must find a balance between a large controlling government and no government at all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mullin. It seems the challenge that you present in the last paragraph of your paper is the most difficult of all, of understanding just how large this government should be in response to our current situation. And one of the principles that you developed was earlier in your paper where you talked about the theoretical goodness of a small military, but then said, well, in an age of weapons of mass destruction, we need a large military to be able to defend ourselves. And so you seem to be saying that at different times, a different size military is necessary in order to retain the freedom of a country. And so can you say more about just our own situation and just how large of a military we need to give our country the proper context for prosperity and maintenance of our freedom, and how that might change with further developments?
Yeah, okay, so I said that it would have been a great option just decades ago. So, before World War II, before the invention of, nuclear weapons, if you had a small military like we had back then, before World War II, our military was very small, and that was fine. We got attacked, and then a bunch of people enlisted, and we had a very big military during the war. And that was fine. Now that we have weapons of mass destruction, it presents an issue where if those are to be used, a lot of people are going to die. So it's something that we need to be very, very keen on defending. And if you have a very small military and a military that is not capable, then you won't be able to do that. So having a sort of small little military that just kind of exists, that won't work. If we find out tomorrow that ISIS has a nuclear weapon, they're going to bomb us, we need to be moving yesterday. In the future, as weapons, I'm sure will get more and more advanced. We may have to decide, hey, there's a bigger threat from these guys over here who've got, such and such a weapon. We need a bigger military, or we need at least the capability to deal with that.
All right. Well, would you imagine? Could you imagine a situation in which our country would need to return to something like a Spartan state of continual military preparedness? I mean, for the children of free families, military preparedness was pretty much the content of life, and Sparta was in a kind of a state of continual military camp. And are you saying that if we are in circumstances where we would need to go to just that sort of culture to defend ourselves, that such a life would also be necessary for us?
Yeah, I mean, we can look at Israel. That's basically what Israel has right now. Everyone, when they turn 18, they serve 2 years in the military, and they do that because they're under a constant state of attack. They're literally surrounded by people who literally do not believe that Israel has the right to exist, and that's very dangerous for them. And because of that, they have basically had a force. They've gone leaps and bounds in intelligence, leaps and bounds in weapons technology, and they need to do all that, or else they wouldn't exist right now. And so, if there's a situation in which, that becomes necessary, I can absolutely imagine a situation where that would be necessary.
Mm-hmm. And what would that, I mean, what are you thinking of? Like our own neighbors becoming our military enemies? Mexico and Canada being continually encroaching on our borders, or what sort of thing do you have in mind?
Possibilities are infinite. Obviously, I mean, if for example, we've been having a ton of immigrants coming across our southern border, Mexico, and not just Mexicans. Actually, Mexicans are outnumbered by Middle Eastern people coming over. And so, if we were, if a bunch of terrorists started coming across from the southern border, and started invading, California, Texas, Arizona. Then absolutely. I don't know that it would necessarily require that we, draft people, but that's what the draft exists, so that if something happens, if we were just not on our game and they hit us hard, they bombed Camp Pendleton, and then that's absolutely, that would be a situation where I think maybe we need to consider that.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Mullin. Any other questions?
I was going to ask about the nature of technology today and the cost associated with that. So in the revolution, a farmer could own a musket, but your neighbor is not going to own an F-18 or an aircraft carrier, or be able to, one is afford it, and then secondly, the technology is so complex that it may take years of training and continual practice to maintain your level of, preparedness. So, is that kind of one of the reasons that you think that we need to have some level? I mean, I guess, is that the reason that you can't go back to a small army or a small military where each state would maybe have, their own Air Force or their own Navy or their own force that could compete with a government? If we have individuals, and my neighbors have their gun that they're trying to fight against an F-18, you're not going to win. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on how do we have a balance where the overall country has billions of dollars, ships and planes that the individuals could not afford to.
All right. Well, first off, I would say I've heard a lot of stuff, where people say, obviously gun control is a big thing going on right now, and a lot of people say, okay, well, we need our AR-15s to protect against the government. People say, okay, well, the government's got tanks, they've got drones, your AR-15 is not going to do anything. Well, that's simply not true. Guerrilla wars specifically, are fought and won by riflemen. Drones and tanks are largely irrelevant. They do play a certain part, but if the United States government wanted to subjugate its own people, barring bombing the entire country with nuclear warheads, which they could do, if they wanted to have some country left over that they could control, they would have to fight it on the ground. And there are 70 million gun owners in the United States. China's foot soldiers are like 20 million. And China has the largest standing army. So those are largely irrelevant. But at the end, when I was talking about each state militia, that would be part of the upkeep. So there would be citizens who go in and they almost like the National Guard, perhaps a little more intense than the National Guard. But there would be people who would go in on the weekends and they would they would practice, they would drill. Each state would have its own air force. They'd have their own infantry divisions and stuff like that. And then if we were going to go fight off in a foreign land, then we could get the California Air Force and the Texas Air Force and all those guys and put them all in together into one if we need to go fight somewhere else.
Other questions?
I was wondering about, if you take the example of the Spartans and how they were so prepared for war, and they were raised from an early age to be these vicious, terrible warriors. And I was just wondering about does sometimes our preservation of life interfere with our quality of life? And the fact that maybe, training little boys to be vicious warriors, is that going to interfere with their quality of life? And maybe we'd rather just be vulnerable as opposed to being, obsessive warrior people.
Yeah, well, that's why I think we don't have that in the United States right now, right? You don't have to join the military if you don't want to. But, but in a situation like, again, with Israel, for example, it's basically you can have